From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. On Capitol Hill, at the heart of the political establishment in Washington, D.C., just as things should be slowing down for Christmas, instead, senators are facing a campaign frenzy.
President-elect Trump's controversial cabinet picks are working to shore up support. Former Congressman Tulsi Gabbard is meeting with key senators as part of her second-week blitz on Capitol Hill.
Pacing miles of corridors, followed by an entourage of assistants, is a woman in a dark suit. She's instantly recognizable by her distinctive streak of grey hair and the cameras following her every move.
How did the meeting go today?
It's a good meeting, thank you. I look forward to meeting with as many senators as possible.
Tulsi Gabbard is a woman on a mission. She has to convince enough senators to back her as President Trump's pick for the next Director of National Intelligence. But it's looking tricky, with the press reporting that even Republican senators aren't convinced. And as she paces around the Capitol, questions about her past keep coming back to haunt her.
Do you have any regrets on meeting with Assad in 2017? Trump called Assad a butcher today.
Do you believe Russia represents one of America's primary adversaries?
I'm focused on meeting with senators and answering their questions and looking forward to the process going forward.
So why is Tulsi Gabbard such a controversial pick? And what would it mean for America and its allies if she gets the job at the top of American intelligence? The story today: Tulsi Gabbard, Trump, and the spying game.
My name is Tom Newton Dunn, and I've been in America covering the US election for The Times.
And Tom, it feels like the news hasn't really stopped since the election. We've had a whole host of Trump's announcements on people he wants to have in his administration. Many of them have been quite controversial. We're still in the period when they haven't quite been confirmed yet. So just talk us through some of that selection and the controversy surrounding them.
The ones that have been particularly controversial, although Donald Trump has been keeping us all busy with all of them, quite frankly, from RFK to many others, is the national security pick. His entire national security team, maybe bar one, Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, is definitely seen by the media, the Washington establishment, everybody is somewhat out of the ordinary, I think is probably the politest way to put it. People with no experience whatsoever of national security, some experience of serving in the military, but no experience whatsoever of intelligence roles or any national government. And it's certainly raised some question marks, raised some pretty high eyebrows, but I mean, it's obviously intentional by Donald Trump as well. You know, he wants to bring in people to these big national security briefs to shake things up and to do things differently, as he might put it, to drain the swamp.
It does seem deliberately disruptive. One of the picks has come back into the spotlight following events in Syria over the last week or so. So just tell us a bit about Tulsi Gabbard. What post is she being nominated for, and what would the role entail?
Tulsi Gabbard is a former Democratic congresswoman who's been on, it's fair to say, quite a political journey in her life. She was a Democrat for many years. She's representative from Hawaii. The first Samoan American representative in Congress, actually, but drifted libertarian right as the time went on, eventually left the Democratic Party and then left Congress in 2021, and over the summer joined the Republican Party because of Donald Trump. And since August, she's been the biggest cheerleader, has appeared on rally stages with him, and is very, very firmly in the Trump camp.
To stand here with you today, President Trump, and announce that I'm joining the Republican Party. I'm looking forward to casting my vote for President Trump because you are our best and only hope in this election to lead our country toward a future where every one of us can live in a truly free, peaceful, and prosperous nation.
Therefore, it may well be that Donald Trump saw her loyalty, which he's, as we know, pricing above everything else in his cabinet picks, his big administration picks this time round after having quite a rough experience with some old hands last time round. He's nominated Tulsi Gabbard to be his Director of National Intelligence, DNI. And the DNI role, it's an interesting one, actually. It has been around for that long. It's a post-9/11 creation. And effectively, the DNI sits above all the other intelligence officers, bureaucracies. There are 18 different US intelligence agencies. I didn't know that either. I'm amazed. I did have to look them all up. So the DNI role sits above a lot of them and coordinates all that intelligence, FBI, CIA, Defense Intelligence, National Security Council, etc. And then crucially, the second part of the role is to then basically tell the president. So the other thing the DNI does is prepare the president's morning intelligence briefing. Every morning, every president gets an intelligence briefing, and the DNI is in charge of precisely what the president knows. So it's a pretty powerful position, really.
Wow, so this will shape his view of the world, whatever Tulsi Gabbard tells him.
Absolutely. She will decide precisely, to quote the phrase, what the president knows.
And Tom, you mentioned her very interesting political journey in getting here. You know, her transition from being a Democrat to now a very loyal Trump Republican. Tell us a bit about her background beyond politics, though, and how that might have shaped her worldview.
Well, she's also a National Guard Army officer, so she's a US Army reservist, in other words. And I think that does seem to have shaped her thinking quite a bit. So she has not served in combat roles, but sort of medical roles and administrative roles with the Hawaii National Guard. And she's been deployed several times. She's deployed to Iraq in 2004, 2005, which is a particularly tough time to be in Iraq. A lot of conflict, a lot of American fatalities. She was also deployed later on to the Horn of Africa, and she's risen to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, as Americans might call it. So, reasonably senior in the US Army Reserve. She's certainly done a lot of time with this and worked very hard and climbed the reservist ranks, if you like. And she argues that's given her quite a lot of military experience and security experience. Others might argue that it gives you one view, effectively, a footprint on the ground from a reasonably low level in terms of the army when you think the people running it are generals. But certainly her time in Iraq, her time when America was fighting those optional wars, the wars on terror, she certainly seems to be quite scarred by her experiences and has been very anti-interventionist as a result. And her worldview is basically America running around the world fighting wars that it can't often win and ends up having to withdraw from is the precise opposite it should do. It wastes a lot of US money and it wastes a lot of US lives.
And in terms of her politics since then, you mentioned that she was sort of a libertarian Democrat. In a way, that seems to fit in with what we know of quite a lot of Trump's administration.
Yeah, there is a very strong libertarian bent to Trump's administration. Trump himself is fairly libertarian, but there's certainly, the right wing of the Republican Party, libertarian wing of the Republican Party, almost, if you like, sort of meets the other end, the left, if you like, which there is a very strong libertarian tradition of as well. And I don't think it's really possible to sum up Trump's cabinet at the moment, and possibly even Donald Trump himself, as a particular traditional type of politics. He's not right or left wing, but he does have this sort of very libertarian feel, which is government should do an awful lot less and the individual citizen should really be allowed to do an awful lot more of what they want.
So that's the political journey she's been on in order to get herself nominated. Just explain why she's turned out to be such a controversial pick.
She has expressed over her time and over her libertarian journey, if you like, some pretty strong views about countries which have been very traditionally associated to be America's enemies. So Russia, for example, she attacked the West and attacked the US when Russia invaded Ukraine to say it was the Western America's fault, effectively by goading Russia into having to do this because Ukraine's their sphere of influence and America and NATO and the EU should not have been encouraging Ukraine to join the European Union.
The thing that is most tragic about this heartbreaking situation with this war is that it could have been avoided. If President Biden and NATO had done exactly what you were just talking about in agreeing, hey, we're going to take NATO off the table for Ukraine, something that both the U.S. and NATO have agreed is not likely to ever happen, and something that is a legitimate security concern for Russia. They won't accept having U.S. and NATO troops on their border within Ukraine. Had the U.S. and NATO leadership done this, this situation could have been prevented.
Tom, since she's been nominated, events in the Middle East and the fall of the Assad regime in Syria have really brought her back into the spotlight again. Just go back and tell us a bit about her stance on Assad and Syria.
It's been a bit unfortunate for Tulsi Gabbard, really, because she was one of several very controversial picks. Pete Hegseth as Trump's defense secretary, obviously very controversial as well. And he was really one getting all the flack. A variety of different sex scandals and drinking allegations emerged that made him look in severe trouble for getting his nomination through the Senate, getting Senate approval. Tulsi Gabbard, really, although possibly more controversial in terms of her CV, was slightly flying, if you like, behind Pete Hegseth and getting away with a lot less scrutiny. Until, of course, Assad fell and the Assad regime collapsed in Syria. And now the spotlight has swung very powerfully right back onto Tulsi Gabbard. For the reason being, she didn't just express some pretty strong pro-Russia views, also some pretty strong pro-Iranian views, but also some pretty strong pro-Syrian views. She went out to visit Assad in 2017. President Assad met with him, have what appeared to be a fairly sympathetic conversation with him, and then came back to the US and started to question whether it was really true to say that Assad was dropping chemical weapons on his own people. And perhaps that was the Islamists, that was the extremists. And it was wrong to point the finger at Assad. It was wrong for America to trying to do anything about it. So some really very strong views that have gone completely counter to certainly foreign policy under Barack Obama for 8 years and then George Bush for 8 years before him. And that riled a lot of people in Congress.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger, a friend of yours, also a military veteran, a Republican, he said on Twitter when he heard about your visit, quote, fact-finding mission, fact, 50,000 plus dead children in Syria. Tulsi Gabbard, I hope you didn't meet with their butcher, Assad.
I'll tell you what I heard from the Syrian people that I met with, Jake, walking down the streets in Aleppo, in Damascus. They expressed happiness and joy at seeing an American walking through their streets, but they said, why is it that the United States, its allies and other countries are providing support, are providing arms to terrorist groups like al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, Arar al-Sham, ISIS, who are on the ground there raping, kidnapping, torturing, and killing the Syrian people?
She was thought of as a bit of a crank at the time. With Assad falling, of course, and everything we now know about Assad's regime being viewed with rocket fuel because of all the appalling atrocities emerging, the details of it emerging from his prisons. Questions again are being asked about her views, why she held them, and why someone with those views could hold not just a senior, but the most senior job in US intelligence.
And do we have any sign yet of how she's going to try and navigate around that? And you know, what her advice to Donald Trump on Syria might be?
We don't, to be brutally honest, because she has been incredibly quiet about Syria. She hasn't said a thing about Syria, the fall of Assad, since his regime collapsed. She's been going to Capitol Hill, talking to senators, some Republican senators. She's been quite busy retweeting their positive comments to the more pro-Trump Republican senators. She has in the past, in fairness to her, criticized Assad as well. She gave a TV interview, which has been replayed quite a bit in the US over the last few weeks, in which she did call Assad a brutal dictator when she was coming under quite a bit of pressure for her for a visit to Syria and to see Assad. But Trump is absolutely standing by her, and very publicly so.
Let me ask you about former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. You picked her to be the Director of National Intelligence.
Right.
In 2017, she had 2 secret meetings with Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. Do you have questions or concerns about those meetings?
No. And he's got bigger problems right now.
Well, do you think it makes it hard for her?
His country is collapsing.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it compromises her ability to handle that?
I met with Putin. I met with President Xi of China. I met with Kim Jong-un twice. Does that mean that I can't be president?
Do you have confidence in Tulsi Gabbard?
I do. So does she's a very respected person.
So he very publicly took her with him to the Army-Navy American football game on Saturday, which is a big national event, annual event in the US. And he took with him and stood in his box right next to Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard, which is a big symbol, if you like, that not only is he going to stand by them, but these are precisely the people who should stand shoulder to shoulder with the US military, the Army and the Navy, because they have served alongside them and they're the right kind of people. So Trump is very much digging in on his nomination for her, as he is with Pete Hegseth, and she's digging in, obviously, with that too, fighting her own battle. And I think it's going to be an absolutely intriguing battle now between Trump and certainly some Republicans, Republican hawks, of which there still are quite a few in the Senate, to see whether she gets through.
Trump has made it quite clear that he doesn't want to get involved with Syria. He's put up messages on social media. I imagine that must come as a relief to her.
I think that probably does. Yeah, I mean, Trump is anti-interventionist on pretty much every conflict there is. That's his shtick. But certainly he was very, very clear that Syria's problems with the collapse of the Assad regime and whatever the potential chaos that causes in Syria, which is concerning a whole load of Western politicians, is absolutely not America's problem. There will be no American troops, there'll be no peacekeeping, there'll be no funding, there'll be nothing, because quite simply, it's time for Americans to stay at home and not get involved. So that is very much Tulsi Gabbard's world viewpoint, really, for the last sort of decade and a half. Absolutely chimes with Donald Trump's, which is probably another reason why he picked her. I think she is both a big disruptor into the intelligence community, which is a whole group of people which Trump has famously disliked for many years. He's blamed them for what he calls the hoax on Russia, on compromising material that turned out not quite to be true on him. He blames the intelligence services for all that. And when people criticize Tulsi Gabbard, as they have been over the last couple of weeks since the Assad regime's collapse, Trump takes to Twitter to say, well, of course the deep state would say that, wouldn't they? Because they're the deep state. And they don't want Tulsi Gabbard coming in with my new interesting policies, which are better for America. So it really is quite a ding-dong. And the upshot of this is Tulsi Gabbard is going to run a very substantial intelligence structure of 18 different agencies in the US in 6 weeks' time, who are both very hostile to her and her views. And quite how on earth they work together is going to be really quite fascinating.
It certainly is. And among her views, which will cause trouble for many of those intelligence agencies, you mentioned earlier she had views on Iran, for example, which were very different to the traditional US government stance. Just tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, she bitterly opposed Donald Trump's assassination of Qasem Soleimani, which he did towards the end of his first term, who was for a very long time the leader of Iran's IRGC, effectively their foreign force who go around the world backing people like Hezbollah and Hamas and causing trouble, as the West or Israel might see it. She thought his killing, his targeted assassination, was a terrible thing.
If he wants to go to war with Iran, then come to Congress and say why he feels that's important for our national security. That did not happen.
But to be clear, he hasn't suggested that he wants to go to war with Iran.
Well, he has gone to war with Iran. That's the reality of the situation, and how the decision that President Trump made, as you mentioned, it's undermined our national security in two ways. Iran is no longer complying with any of the restrictions, the Iran nuclear agreement, and they are speeding closer and closer to developing nuclear weapons capabilities, which increases the threat to the United States and to the world.
She's opposed sanctions on Iran. She opposed Trump pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal, although others did as well. And all of this, again, is because she says America doesn't need an enemy in Iran. There is a different way of dealing with the Iranians, and it's not by being tough, and it's not by holding their feet to the fire. Now, interestingly, Trump is in a different place on that. He's not particularly interested in troops and intervention and going to war, but he's been very tough on Iran in the past. He ordered that assassination of Soleimani, and he's been talking quite belligerently about crushing Iran and crushing Iran's terrorist sponsorship. So unclear, really, how those two align their views when they all get into office.
You also mentioned her controversial views on Russia. She certainly started off supporting them in Syria, but she seemed to follow their narrative into Ukraine and in other cases too. Just give us a sense of how supportive she's been of the Russian government.
Well, very supportive, really, to the point that what she says on Russia end up quite often being the Kremlin's talking lines, to the point that she's been accused of being a useful idiot in the US. Hillary Clinton even accused her of being a Russian asset.
I'm not making any predictions, but I think they've got their eye on somebody who's currently in the Democratic primary and are grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's the favorite of the Russians. They have a bunch of, sites and bots and other ways of supporting her so far.
She denied. She threatened to sue Hillary Clinton and has since withdrawn that.
This is outrageous and offensive on so many levels. I've served as a member of Congress now for almost 7 years, receiving high-level national security and intelligence briefings, serving on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Armed Services Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, working to ensure the safety and security of the people of this country.
But a lot of her talking points, what she likes to say, does end up mirroring quite a lot of what ends up coming out the Kremlin, which a lot of people call Russian propaganda. I mean, another example, when she was in Congress, when she was a congresswoman, she brought forward a bill to pardon Edward Snowden, who you remember was the great NSA leaker, who worked for the National Security Agency, the technological bugging service, leaked a vast trove of information to various newspapers and has ended up living in Russia. She would like to see him pardoned and forgiven for all his sins, which is also very much counter current US policy. So much so that when she was nominated by Trump a month ago for DNI, to pretty much everybody's shock, the Russian state media were delighted. She appeared all over Russian TV for several nights under the headline, Comrade Gabbard.
Kremlin-controlled TV praising some of President-elect Trump's cabinet picks, also speaking favorably about Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, for repeatedly parroting Kremlin talking points on the war in Ukraine. She, from day one, clarified the reason for Russia's special operation in Ukraine, the anchor says, criticizing the actions of the Biden administration. Gabbard's words in 2022, right after Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, caused even panelists on Russian state TV to cynically ask if she's a Kremlin agent. Yes, the host said, without providing any evidence.
It's not the greatest of cachets to be hanging around your neck when you're in front of some hawkish Republican senators. No, not the ideal look.
Or in front of the intelligence agencies you're about to help run.
No, not. And it's an odd actual thing for Russia to do as well, because if she's your asset or you think she's going to be hugely useful, trolling her and Trump like that to the nth degree is probably not going to be helping her get into position. But I think for the Russians and the Kremlin, who do dictate quite a lot of the material that goes on to Russian state media, state TV channels, they just couldn't help themselves. It's worth pointing out quite strongly that Tulsi Gabbard vehemently denies being a Russian asset. Furthermore, no proof has actually ever emerged at all that she's been in Russia's payroll, taking dictation from the Russians. So she very strongly opposes, very strongly denies this.
What's the reaction been like in DC, amongst the intelligence, foreign policy community, or even amongst Republicans?
They have met her appointment with slightly less glee than Moscow, to the point that it's left a lot quite staggered, quite horrified. They don't see her as the sort of person who's qualified for the job with no experience of national government or national intelligence, but also with her views that are actually hostile to certainly previous interests of US administrations. Nikki Haley, for example, who was a prominent member of Trump's first administration, Nikki Haley was his UN ambassador and obviously ran against him for president as well, has said she's the least qualified person she can think of to hold that DNI role.
What are the facts about Tulsi Gabbard? She opposed ending the Iran nuclear deal. She opposed sanctions on Iran. She opposed designating the Iran military as terrorists who say death to America every single day. She went to Syria in 2017 for a photo op with Bashar al-Assad while he was massacring his own people. She said she was skeptical that he was behind the chemical weapons attacks. Now, this to me is disgusting because, Cheney, you and I were at the United Nations when Assad did those chemical attacks on those children. Yep. And you can go back and look at a speech I gave holding up pictures of dead children who had been killed by chemical attacks. Are we comfortable with someone like that at the top of our national intelligence agencies?
Just last week, 100 different former members of the US intelligence and security agencies all got together and wrote a letter to Senator Thune, who's the leader of the Republicans in the US Senate, to say, we really think you should look very, very closely indeed at her nomination because she's the wrong person for this job. Please do not allow her nomination through. So quite serious concern, not carping from what you might call the usual suspects. You might call the deep state if you're Donald Trump, but serious people who've done serious jobs in the past who are really quite concerned that she could be a potential threat to US interests in that job. So what we're pretty confident now, despite Donald Trump not wanting them to happen, is that there will be Senate confirmation hearings for a lot of these people, the Pete Hegseth and certainly Tulsi Gabbard. So she's going to have to explain precisely what she meant when she said the West were responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's going to be really, really difficult. It's going to be hours worth of totally televised and absolutely fascinating testimony. And quite frankly, it's going to be a popcorn moment for us obsessive observers.
If you're enjoying this episode of The Story, you can listen to more by subscribing to the podcast. It's completely free, and we'll put a link below in the description box for different ways you can follow us. How much of a worry are some of these appointments to America's allies?
Well, there are real worries there. I've talked to quite a lot of people in Whitehall about this, calling them from here in New York, and there's real concern. I mean, officially, the US government hasn't said anything at all on this, and they wouldn't. Donald Trump's just been elected by a fair majority, and that's that. And the British government definitely don't want to fall out with him over this. But behind the scenes, quietly in Whitehall, there's really serious concern. Tulsi Gabbard, I think, is causing the most concern, not least because of her views and what she might do with that intelligence. I don't think there's a necessary fear that she's going to get all this incredibly high-grade intelligence that the Five Eyes share, us, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. We share pretty much everything these days. There's a category of intelligence which is UK eyes only, which is absolutely top secret, but even that gets shared with the Americans most of the time. I don't think the fear is that Tulsi Gabbard is going to email a lot of it over to Moscow, to the FSB, the KGB's successor. It'd be really hard for her to do that, to be honest. She's going to be with people all the time. Everything she says and does is going to be monitored. But it's what she chooses to do with that intelligence internally, I think, is the concern. So as she has that role of intelligence overseer, and what Trump knows is what she decides to tell him, the fear is she may be selective. She may discard stuff that MI6 or the British government might think is important and promote stuff that we, MI6, etc., don't value at all. So it's more in her sort of selectivity, really. Interestingly, I spoke to Nigel Inkster, who's a deputy chief of MI6, now quite long retired, but he put up the prospect that if things got really bad and the intelligence that we were putting forward, going through the Gabbard sieve, if you like, was getting so mangled or out of shape, there could be a situation where Britain could end up withholding intelligence from the US. And that's a very dangerous thing, because if Donald Trump finds out about that, that will blow apart the entire special relationship, really, with intelligence sharing being the most important part of it.
In extremis, the decision might have to be that certain stuff gets held back. But this is going to be a difficult calculation to make. What the UK government will not want to do is put itself in a position where Trump, in a fit of pique, simply says no more intelligence cooperation.
It was put to me, though, by some of these Whitehall figures that what's going to be really interesting now is not necessarily what Gabbard does, but what her underlings at the agencies do, the CIA or the National Security Council, and what intelligence they choose to share with her. She can't share the bad stuff with Trump that they don't then give to her. So you've got this, I mean, it's a typical sort of spy game, really, of who knows what, who's sharing what, what's really going on. And I expect that very much to play out in Washington, D.C. over the next 4 years, if she gets confirmed. And also, I suspect quite a bit of leaking to be going on. So the agencies, intelligence agencies, if they're not getting their way, and she's not sharing intelligence with the president, they find out, then you could see bits of it, hopefully censored bits of it, all over the front page of, the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal.
Well, Tom, tell us about those confirmation hearings, because there is a process before any of these candidates are confirmed in post.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really, really interesting question. Donald Trump has a majority in the Senate, but a very thin one now. So he does need senators' support to get these people through, and really all his senators' support. So I think there could be a real problem there.
And Tom, how much does it tell us about what we can expect from Trump's America? When you've got a defense secretary who wants to really shake things up, you've got a national director of intelligence who seems to be sort of quite pro-Russia. This is a huge shift in everything we've known of America thus far. What does it tell us about what we can expect?
I mean, it's definitely not American politics as normal. It's not American security as normal. It's very, very far from it. There is a counterpoint to this, the doom and gloom argument, if you like, because we just really don't know what is going to happen. And as it's been put to me by some very keen observers in the UK on this, it could be that these appointments get into their departments with the views they currently hold. They're then surrounded by a lot of very impressive and quite charming officials who then persuade them that actually the views they held, whether it's on DNI or Russia or Syria, aren't quite correct. And by the way, here is the raw, naked intelligence that prove this to be so. And it may be, as one of them put it to me, they wake up and smell the coffee and decide actually they got it wrong and therefore tell the president that he's on the verge of getting it wrong too.
That was Tom Newton Dunn, who's been covering the US elections and their aftermath for The Times. And you can find all of that coverage and more at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producer today was Chris Wade. The executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We do read them all. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.